As news from the conflict in Ukraine continued to dominate the headlines, many are worried about what could come next. But in order to know where we may be headed, we first should look back to see how this all began, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of a man named Vladimir Putin. I'm Ryan Osborne, and this is World in Context. Hello everyone, welcome to World in Context. I'm Ryan Osborne, and today we're kicking off a new series on the war in Ukraine, or more specifically a series examining some of the reasons that we got to this point, how a war like this could have happened. Now, many people were taken by surprise when this thing started, assuming that something like this was confined to the 20th century before that a war of this scale could not happen in modern times. But the hard truth is, this war was always going to happen, and the signs were clear for a very long time that something was not right. And many of us just wanted to look the other way. The Cold War was over. We didn't want to think about this issue anymore. But if World War II has taught us anything, it's that leaving a festering wound and not addressing it properly can end up causing a much graver injury in the end. So this war, unfortunately, may even end up growing in magnitude and spreading beyond Ukraine's borders, depending on how things go. But let's not go there yet. Right now, I think the best thing to do is for us to take a step back and look at some of the clues that were missed to try and develop a nice and informed way of thinking about the situation as we move forward to see how things might play out. So let's take a historical lens and go back to where the story kind of starts, with the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, the fall of the Soviet Union is a rather complex topic all on its own, one that you could make a pretty lengthy series on, but for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to constrain myself down to bringing up what I think were three pretty big reasons that things went the way they did, that the Soviet Union fell apart. And one of those is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that took a decade. It started in 1979 and it ended in 89. It was a huge draw on the Soviet economy. It demoralized the Soviet military, and it really kind of strained the Soviet military's logistical systems as well. Something that would come back to haunt them in the coming years. And one of those came in 1986. When, to salt the wound on top of the war, in the city of Pripyat, Ukraine, the Chernobyl power station reactor number 4 melted down and exploded catastrophically, exposing the reactor core to the open atmosphere, poisoning countless people and rendering large swaths of land uninhabitable. Now, according to then Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, the costs involved with this cleanup were enormous, and he believed, even asserted, that the true reason the Soviet fell was because of the Chernobyl disaster. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. However, it definitely played a pretty big role. But that combined with the war in Afghanistan definitely was a perfect storm brewing. You had suddenly the liquidators, many people of which were from the Soviet military or working class. They came together to try and handle this situation. And you had a lot of already pretty demoralized troops that were called in to handle the situation, many of which were put into suicide missions or near suicide missions in the cleanup. And it was overall just not a great situation. But in my opinion, the biggest reason that the Soviet Union fell wasn't either of these two, though tied in with the other reason I'm about to bring up. They definitely played a role. The biggest reason was the ongoing arms race with the United States, which the Soviets were already struggling with in the 1970s before they even went into Afghanistan. And you couple these three together, and the Soviet economy never stood a chance. It was never going to recover. Now, things started to fall apart around this time, especially after Chernobyl, but it wasn't all at once. And the leadership in Moscow knew something wasn't right. Things were going ill. and they did everything they could to try and turn things around. In vain, mostly, but they still tried. One of the measures was giving greater autonomy to the satellite members of the Soviet Union. Now, this was under the guise of, we're giving you more control over your own affairs because we trust you and you're good communists and contribute greatly to the Soviet Union, blah, 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 blah. It wasn't true. The real facts on the ground were that the Soviet Union no longer had the economic ability to force their will upon their empire. And their military had been quite strained by the war in Afghanistan. Their logistics were not ready if there were to be any kind of massive civil strife, and there wasn't money to back up any kind of conflict like this either. So immediately with this new autonomy, many of these Soviet satellite states held votes to leave the Soviet Union entirely. Democracy spread through like a wildfire, and the Soviets could do nothing to stop it. So as things were getting dire within the Soviet Union, in fact, even before Chernobyl, a man named Boris Yeltsin was appointed by Gorbachev to clean out corruption within Moscow. And he would end up going on to be mayor of Moscow and then president of the Russian Republic after that. He would oversee many of these democratic reforms that were spreading throughout the Soviet Union and other measures that were being taken to try and hold things together. And he would oversee the last days of the Soviet Union. In fact, there was a brief coup attempt at the very end to take Gorbachev down, and Boris Yeltsin, to the surprise of many, rallied to the support of Gorbachev and not of the people trying to take over. He was seen as a hero by many and an example of what things in the future could come. He was friendly to the West, and he did not seem to have much interest in pursuing the Cold War any further. Unfortunately for the people of Russia, he became very corrupt very quickly. He spent a huge amount of his time enriching his family. He looked the other way with organized crime. He established a class of oligarchs. In 1993, he dissolved the Russian Congress so that he could change the Russian Constitution and expand his executive power, essentially ruling through presidential edict for the rest of his administration. He invaded Chechnya in 1994. And in 1996, he actually won re-election. However, he spent most of 1997 recovering from a heart attack that was brought on by the stress from the election. So in the midst of all of this, life post-Soviet Union for the average Russian wasn't very good. And this wasn't necessarily a problem exclusive to the Russians. Many post-Soviet countries struggled to find a new identity and to integrate into the world that they had been isolated away from behind the Iron Curtain for decades. But in Russia, while progress was being made in other countries slowly, things simply stagnated in Russia. And this can be seen with a number of studies that show that the average lifespans decreased pretty significantly, especially in males in the 1990s in Russia. And while some of this data I do find to be a little dubious, it's still useful, and there's still something of value that can be gleaned in it. Drug use exploded in Russia. Unemployment became a huge problem as the factories that used to be state-owned now had to struggle to try and become private businesses, and many just couldn't keep up with this and just went out. And organized crime came in because when people can't work, they have to make a living, and typically gangs offer a lot of that. Human trafficking became a serious problem. Local police were being bought and paid by these growing mobs. Businesses simply started to pay protection money as an average normal thing of life. In some areas, it was so bad that the businesses had to pay up to 50% of their monthly earnings to the local mob in protection money. This was simply untenable, and vultures, to make things worse, were flooding into this new market from the outside world, eager to look for opportunities in Russia. Unfortunately, the Russian people were very naive when it came to dealings with the free market. And while many people went in good faith, others didn't. There were many scams. People were offered bad faith contracts. They were tricked out of their earnings or their savings or their properties, which they weren't even used to being property owners at this point, because again, everything used to belong to the state. And at the same time, Boris Yeltsin was nourishing the creation of an oligarch class. Things were so bad for the average Russian citizen, and they were so discontented with the system that in 1999, going in towards the 2000 election, Yeltsin had 2% of the polling. Only 2% of people wanted to vote for Boris Yeltsin and his prime minister, Vladimir Putin. You cannot win an election like that. World in Context will be right back after this quick ad break. Welcome back. For Boris Yeltsin, this was a serious matter for his family, even because he knew if he lost the 2000 election, he was going to be prosecuted for many of the terrible things he did. His family was going to be prosecuted as he had turned it into an organized crime family at this point. This couldn't happen. And luckily for him, the stars seemed to align perfectly in his favor so that this wouldn't happen in September of 1999. So I'm going to lean heavily on David Sater's book, The Less You Know, The Better You Sleep. It is a fantastic read about Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin. I would heavily recommend it to anyone who is interested in this topic. And in it, he talks quite a bit about the Moscow bombings in 99. So these began on September 4th, when a bomb was planted in the basement of an apartment building and it exploded, killing a large amount of people. And it didn't end there. There were several more apartment bombings between then and the 16th, and it terrified the public in Russia. It bred an air of hypervigilance. People were taking shifts, night watches, day watches. They were making sure to screen every one of the doors of their apartments, checking their ID, questioning people that they claimed to be their family to make sure there were not terrorists coming into their homes. And luckily for the Russian people, this hypervigilance did pay off, as it was either September 21st or 22nd, the exact day escapes me, individuals noticed an individual they didn't recognize in the middle of the night leaving the basement of their apartment. When they attempted to question him, he fled. They called the police. The police came. They checked the basement out and came out sprinting and screaming, telling everyone to get out of the building. There was going to be another bombing. They had discovered a large amount of explosives in the basement. Luckily, however, they did not go off. Perhaps because the bomber fled the scene before he could detonate it. It's unknown. However, the police did catch this man, and this is when things get a little weird. They found on his person papers belonging to the FSB. This man worked for the FSB. Now, the FSB is a government organization for Russia. It's an evolution of the KGB. Think of the FBI and the CIA if they were merged into a single group. That's the FSB. This man worked for that group. The FSB ordered this man released immediately and put out a statement saying that this whole thing was an elaborate training exercise designed to test the vigilance of the Russian people and following the wake of the terror attacks in the weeks prior. Now, many people didn't buy it, especially considering the FSB threw the local authorities under the bus, claiming they were inept and couldn't identify clearly dummy bombs. Well, many people suspected that perhaps Boris Yeltsin was conducting a false flag attack upon his own people in some sort of justification to try and boost his popularity up in some bizarre way. Well, as fate would have it, he would step down in December and would appoint his prime minister, Vladimir Putin, as acting president. So who is Putin? Well, his grandfather was the personal cook for Vladimir Lenin. Fun little tidbit, not really relevant to much. But Putin himself joined the KGB in 1975, worked as the second chief directorate for counterintelligence, and worked as first chief directorate in Leningrad, monitoring foreigners and consular officials. Interestingly, multiple reports also place him in New Zealand at one time, though the reason for this is not known. He also worked undercover from 1985 to 1990 in Dresden, East Germany, as a translator. Many believe he was likely assisting an anti-East German terror group in getting weapons and explosives. After the fall of East Germany, Putin was forced to resign from the KGB, as the Communist Party could never be at fault for anything that happened, and they needed scapegoats. And those who happened to be in Dresden, well, you're out of luck. Clearly you did something wrong. You're not loyal enough. But following the fall of the Soviet Union, he also served briefly as the head of the FSB. Now acting President Vladimir Putin was quick to blame Chechnya for the attack. The war resumed in full, and he ended up drumming up a huge amount of nationalistic support, which he rode all the way to the 2000 election, where he won in a near landslide. He pursued no investigations into his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, or the Yeltsin family, grew the oligarch culture, turned a blind eye to many of the mobs in Moscow, and interestingly became quite wealthy in the years after becoming president. 3 years after the apartment building bombings, the Chechen War is in full swing. It's in the midst of this that on October 23rd, a group of 40 armed-to-the-teeth Chechen terrorists managed to make their way to the heart of Moscow, take an entire theater hostage, and bring the city to a standstill. Local law enforcement is quick to respond, and a stalemate ensues as the terrorists claim to be armed with suicide vests. FSB and Spetsnaz teams Alpha and Vampil eventually make their way onto the scene as well. But rather than attempting to negotiate, FSB and Spetsnaz instead chooses to gas the ventilation systems of the building, incapacitating both terrorist and hostage alike. Spetsnaz then breaches into the building, finds every terrorist incapacitated and unconscious, and executes every single one of them, making sure that none are left alive, questioned. The triage situation outside of the theater was a nightmare. Critical patients were stacked on top of each other while awaiting treatment, or packed into buses like sardines so densely many were crushed to death en route to the hospital. What made things worse is that the FSB refused to share with any of the emergency responders or the hospitals what the gas was that they used to flood the theater's ventilation systems, which delayed treatment for many people and ended with even more dying. Now, the Russian government lied and lied and lied about the death toll. First, it was in the dozens, then the low hundreds, then the high hundreds. And to this day, the official count isn't quite known. It's disputed by some. Now, what's interesting about this whole thing is that questions began to be raised on how an army of terrorists could sneak into the capital of the country undetected. As it turns out, they weren't undetected. FSB had a number of tips about the attack, and they didn't do anything about them. They didn't raise a finger. Worse still, a member of the GRU, a man named Arman Menkiv, made the bombs. FSB interrogated him and then quickly declared that he was, and I quote, loyal to Russia, and that he knows how to keep a military secret. Following the attacks, more cries for involvement in Chechnya came. Putin's popularity soared. Now, a year later, an investigation into the matter essentially came to a screeching halt when the head investigator was murdered under mysterious circumstances. In fact, a lot of individuals who happened to be investigating the FSB or Vladimir Putin himself have a grisly end coming their way, whether it be falling out of a window or being poisoned by a radioactive isotope, or a chemical compound only developed by the Soviet Union in a bioweapons lab during the Cold War, or being literally shot right outside of Kremlin and the gunman never being caught. It seems those who pose a problem to the regime typically live a shorter lifespan. And as if all of this wasn't enough, a year later, in 2004, the FSB was also suspected in the Beslan school massacre. I could go into the details, but frankly, I don't want to on this one because it's horrible. And I think you get the point. This is the kind of person and entity we're talking about here. Someone who will use the most heinous crises, sometimes potentially even orchestrated by himself, to get national support, shore up his own power, and to demonize outside forces that are politically inconvenient. Now, we're going to fast forward a few years here to 2013, and we're going to look at a man named Viktor Yanukovych, who at the time was the president of Ukraine and was seen by many as little more than a puppet from Moscow. This man wanted nothing to do with the European Union, constantly called for closer ties with Russia. He let the Russians use Crimea for their naval bases, exported as much grain as he could to Russia, and he even proposed changing the official language of Ukraine to Russian, for goodness sake. He was ousted by the Ukrainian people in 2014, and he fled to, you guessed it, Russia. It's even reported that he was in Belarus in 2022 during the invasion, awaiting Kiev fall so he could be placed back in power as the rightful president of Ukraine. Now, why am I talking about this guy? Well, he was a bit of a dictator. He used a lot of fear and violence to get his way. And he fell in an interesting point in history where a lot of dictators around the world were being thrown out by their own people. A good example of this was Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, who was brutally killed by his own people in the streets of Libya. And his ousting was supported by the United States and France especially. And this was a little concerning to Putin. Things like this trend, the Arab Spring, dictators going down, democracy kind of spreading. And this became especially alarming when it happened in his own backyard, right in Ukraine, and to one of his own puppets. Now, a lot of people say that the lights were on in the Kremlin constantly during the revolution in Ukraine, that high-ranking officials were coming and going at all hours of the day and the night. And, well, ultimately, Vladimir Putin, it seems, was afraid that he was next, that if Yanukovych fell, and all of these other countries, that perhaps his own people may turn on him. And so, once again, the Russian people needed to have something to be afraid of that Putin could protect them from. And this became the Nazi threat that he talks so much about in Ukraine, and the insanity of the West. Now, one of Russia's claims that the CIA was involved in the revolution, well, there's no proof of it. I can't exactly say it didn't happen, because this was at a time where the CIA was, in fact, helping a lot of democratic movements across the world throw off oppression of their dictators. So it is possible, but there's not really any concrete evidence of it happening. And frankly, him claiming interference in Ukraine by a foreign power is laughable when the president that was in there in the first place was only in there as a puppet of his own will, So these are all things that compounded and finally ended with the separatists in eastern Ukraine popping into existence, suddenly being armed with pretty good high-end Russian equipment, ultimately being poorly trained with bad discipline, this resulting in the tragic downing of a civilian airliner. And following that, there began reports of little green men in Crimea, which at that point was still in Ukraine's control. Now, the little green men was a nickname for Russian troops that were in Russian uniforms but did not have Russian flag insignia. Their vehicles didn't have the Russian Red Star or official markings. They were unofficially there, but it was pretty obvious they were Russian. And the little green men slowly began to take territory out of Crimea. In fact, they took the Ukrainian military by surprise and carved off a huge chunk of that country. Now, it may come as a surprise to many people, but Russia and Ukraine have been at war since 2014, often lobbing shells at each other over the border and in the Donbas region. So this is nothing new to the Ukrainian people. The intensity that happened in 2022 was, but the subtle and manipulative ramp up of Russian military operations is something we're going to talk about pretty soon when we do an episode on Russia's military strategies. But that's going to have to wait for another episode, as I said. For now, this is going to be the end of our podcast. I thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully you learned something interesting. And I'll see you in the next episode of World in Context.